Economic conservatism is a response to the rise of the welfare state and the incremental increasing of taxation, which, as many have argued, results in diminished economic growth and a mounting permanent underclass in American society. It has been well documented, for example, that the U.S. government's now defunct aid to families with dependent children, though intended to financially help single mothers below the poverty line, actually resulted in a dramatic increase in out-of-wedlock births. Because the government, according to ADFC critics, was literally paying women for having children out of wedlock, it got what it paid for. But it got more social pathologies and thus more poverty as well. In 1996, however, President Clinton, a Democrat, in cooperation with the Republican Congress, signed legislation that ended ADFC and replaced it with a program called Temporary Assistance for Needy Families. Although many critics of President Clinton's welfare reform in 1996 predicted dire consequences for the poor, in 2006, the liberal magazine, The New Republic, pointed out that, quote, a broad consensus now holds that welfare reform was certainly not a disaster, and it may, in fact, have worked much as its designers had hoped for, unquote. Given the power of free markets to create wealth, lift people out of poverty, and produce more essential commodities than any other system in the history of the world, economic conservatives are right in touting their views as empirically demonstrable. Yet, as some communitarians and social conservatives have pointed out, the logic of the market, without the moral infrastructure and limits of a stable civil society, has a tendency to colonize institutions and practices that sustain goods that by their very nature cannot be items of consumption. Consider these examples. Should we extend the market's understanding of goods, quote unquote, to account for the good of family life? If parents begin to think of their children as commodities whose value is determined by the free market, is that more rational than our immediate belief that our offspring, by virtue of being human persons, are intrinsically valuable beings of immeasurable worth? Suppose I begin thinking of my bodily organs as property, rather than as real parts of my embodied self that were bestowed on me as gifts by God or nature for which I'm specially responsible. Or what happens when I start to believe that my marriage is merely a legal recognition of a contractually discharged living arrangement rather than a permanent exclusive bond sealed by a promise made to my wife and before God that I am bound by the natural and divine law not to break? Or suppose I begin thinking of my religious faith not as a duty imposed on me by an eternal sovereign that I am obligated by conscience to obey, but rather as a set of beliefs I have freely chosen in order to meet what I believe are my most important needs and desires. In each of these cases, applying the logic of the market has a deflationary effect on the goods in question. They cease to be thought of as intrinsic goods that are worth pursuing or having for their own sake, but rather as instrumental commodities that are good only insofar as the desiring self may want them. They become raw materials over which the self may exercise its power to do with them as it pleases. This is precisely where a rift has developed within conservatism, between what I call market conservatives and traditional moralists. Market conservatives typically argue that because free markets have been so efficient and successful in producing wealth and prosperity, and thus allowing us to enjoy many other goods, the reasoning of the market should be applied to all aspects of life. Because the values of commodities is discovered by calculating the price for which people are willing to pay for them, the value of all apparent goods, including those givens of human nature that traditional moralists believes are objective intrinsic goods and not the product of the human will, carry no more normative weight whatsoever for the market conservative. As he sees it, these givens, far from being truths of human nature on which the common good depends, are constraints on the liberty of each individual to pursue his own subjective vision of the good life. For this reason, for the market conservative, the almost exclusive goal of politics is limited government, by which he means not only a free market economy, but also the elimination of laws or customs that interfere with the pursuit of the desiring self. Thus, on this account, the common good, if you can even call it that, is measured by how unencumbered the individual is from tradition, nature, family ties, religion, etc., to acquire what he wants and when he wants it. And yet, in practical politics, market conservatives and traditional moralists have often found themselves employing similar vocabulary and arriving at similar conclusions on matters of policy, though their underlying rationales are remarkably different. Like the market conservative, the traditional moralist often advances the cause of limited government. So, for example, both will support free markets for such an economic system as, I've already noted, has the best track record of raising standards of living. But what's the point of raising standards of living? For the market conservative, the great end, as C.S. Lewis put it in The Abolition of Man, is to get people fed and clothed. Lewis himself, by the way, was no market conservative. The question of how these citizens conduct their lives, whether they follow the precepts of natural justice, is outside the law's jurisdiction, as long as their conduct does not interfere with the private choices of their fellow citizens to pursue their own visions of the good life. Although the traditional moralist agrees with the market conservative that the acquisition of wealth and being fed and clothed are good things, he views them as worthy of pursuit only because they assist him in advancing his natural duties to spouse, progeny, neighbor, nation, and God. For the traditional moralist, liberty is the freedom to pursue the unchosen goods of natural justice unencumbered by certain external agents, such as criminals or unjust governments. For the market conservative, liberty is freedom to pursue whatever one desires, unencumbered by any non-chosen obligations to spouse, progeny, neighbor, nation, or God. For the traditional moralist, the good is what is desirable in itself, while for the market conservative, desiring something is what makes that something good. As long as free markets and their moral limits were contextualized within a cultural infrastructure that was not consciously inimical to the goals of the traditional moralist, an alliance between market and moral conservatism made a lot of sense. The traditional moralist had good instrumental reasons to support free markets, while the market conservative had good pragmatic reasons to accept the givens of the wider culture, whose mandarins did not have as their primary mission to crush traditional institutions and ways of life and any public dissent that may flow from them. But that's not the world we live in anymore. We reside in a world in which major corporations have created a cultural cartel, a moral monopoly, by which they hope to make the price of acquiescence so cheap and resistance so expensive that their ideological competition will either undergo a hostile takeover or declare civilizational bankruptcy. Perhaps, as some have noted, the market conservative, some people have argued, was never a true friend of the moral conservative. I think that's simplistic and not the case. But we can't ignore the place and time at which we find ourselves. In fact, in my own sort of pilgrimage to conservatism as a young man, some of the authors that influenced me deeply were Michael Novak and George Gilder, and a young congressman from Georgia named Newt Gingrich, who authored a book called Window of Opportunity, all of which really appealed to the fact that free markets within the context of a moral order actually led to not only human flourishing economically, but also in terms of civil society. As somebody that was a young liberal at the time, that was the kind of argument that drew me to conservatism. It was one that suggested that markets, far from being hostile to the poor, actually elevated them. But it was always within the context of a moral order.